Never bet against Alireza Firouzja. In this game, he finds himself in a great deal of trouble through no fault of his own, really. This was played in Title Tuesday, July 4th. His opponent is Raza Mazdavi, a strong FIDE master who's been rated almost 2,900 on chess.com. So, a formidable opponent. So, let's see what happens in this game as the tragedy occurs on the chessboard, and then let's see how Alireza handles it. Alireza has white. He begins with d4. His opponent plays knight to f6, and he plays bishop to g5, the Trompovsky variation. He's been playing this quite a bit online. His opponent plays g6, basically inviting Firouzja to take on f6. And after ef6, black would like to play d5, then actually develop the bishop at d6 and use these kingside pawns to attack. So Alireza avoids that and just plays c4, bishop g7, knight c3, and very quickly they enter a King's Indian defense, and after bishop e2, this is just a mainline Averbach system of the King's Indian. And white's goal here basically is to prevent e5. If black plays e5, then he takes, and then the exchange of queens and knight to d5, and black is actually completely lost here. The piling up on the pinned knight on f6, hitting the c7 pawn, and that would be game over. So what black plays here is c5. Firouzja plays d5, gaining the space, and then his opponent plays h6, basically asking the bishop a question: which diagonal do you want to be on? And he plays bishop to h4, keeping the bishop opposite that queen and putting some pressure on this e7 pawn. And his opponent plays b5, basically taking a Benko gambit approach. The idea is that black sacrifices these a and b pawns and then attacks down the a and b files and gets compensation that way. And that fits well because there's this bishop at g7 screaming down that diagonal. cb5 is played, and now queen to a5 pins the knight and actually threatens to take the pawn on e4. Firouzja plays f3, which is a novelty, but a perfectly fine move, making sure the e-pawn is defended. Now a6, wanting Firouzja to capture on a6, and then, again, get that counterplay down the a and b files. But Alireza plays a4. The idea is he wants to just plant a piece on this square and block those files. His opponent plays a b5. Now, this is where the chess tragedy occurs. Firouzja clearly wants to play bishop takes b5, a perfectly normal move in the Benko structure. White does this all the time. But he plays the move instead, bishop to c4. An obvious mouse slip. And he loses his bishop, pawn takes, with no compensation at all. Now, he's just lost. Firouzja is just lost here. He's down a pawn. He doesn't have activity to compensate for it. But it is Title Tuesday. It is a blitz game. So he decides to play on. Let's see what happens. Knight g to e2, a normal move. Knight to a6. His opponent wants to play the knight to b4 and then come into d3 and check the king at e1. Castles, knight to b4, continuing the journey to d3. Queen to d2. Bishop to d7. And now Firouzja plays bishop takes f6. Now this gives his opponent a decision. He could take with the e-pawn, but that would weaken this pawn a little bit. But this looks like that probably was the better choice. He instead plays bishop takes. And this is the first of a few subpar choices from black that helps Firouzja get back into the game. He's able to take the pawn at h6. He gets one pawn, and his queen is near black's king, so that's something in his favor. The knight goes to d3. It threatens b2. It could come to e5 for defense. f4, beginning to press on the king side and in the center. Bishop to g4. Now f5. The idea for Firouzja is to take on g6 and maybe create some threats down the f file. He still has nothing here, by the way. Black is completely winning, but he's playing the best moves he can. Bishop to g7, queen to g5, now bishop to e2. You're up a piece, you exchange pieces. That's sort of the normal strategy. If you're up material, you exchange down to an endgame. Knight takes e2, and rook f to b8. A perfectly logical move, placing the rook on the b file and attacking the b2 pawn. But there's something we should take note of. While rook f to b8 makes a lot of sense, you're removing a piece from the king side, you're removing a potential defensive piece. If you're up a pawn, you probably don't need to play quite this aggressively. And Firouzja takes on g6, and now this rook on f1 is putting some pressure down the f file, and the rook on f8 is no longer there to oppose it. The best move for black here is to take on g6, but after queen g6, we can see the rook can come to f3, the knight can come to g3, threaten to enter on f5 and h5, and we can see why black might not want to do that. Computers show that white really doesn't have anything here and that black is still completely winning, but I can see why he wouldn't want to play that. And instead, he plays the move f6. And this is a mistake, because now this pawn on g6 controls these light squares, and Firouzja begins to get real counterplay against black's king. Queen to g4, he can enter into e6 potentially. Knight to e5, hits the queen, and he decides to play the queen to h5. The reason is, I think he's saving this e6 square for the knight. He wants to play the knight at e2 to f4, and then that knight can hop into e6. Rook takes b2, knight to f4, doing exactly as we just described, aiming for e6, and now queen to d2. The knight can't go to e6 right now because that would be queen to g2 checkmate. So the first thing he does is he plays rook a to d1. He wants to kick that queen around a little bit, maybe put it on a weaker square. The knight covers the g2 square. Queen to e3 check, king to h1, and queen to e4. Keeps a look on this square. Knight takes g6, giving up the piece to take care of that pawn was actually what computers recommend. That pawn is so dangerous. Queen takes e4, rook to e1, queen to c2. Rook to e2 hits the queen, rook to b1. Obviously, you can't take the queen because rook takes f1 would be mate. So rook e to e1, rook takes e1, rook takes e1, and queen to d2. Hitting the rook, hitting the knight. Again, computers show that knight takes g6, giving up the piece for the pawn is still the best. Queen to d2, now rook to f1, moves the rook away, defends the knight on f4. King to f8, and now knight to e6 check, and we begin to see all sorts of threats on these light squares. Obviously, king to g8, queen to h7 would be checkmate. So he is forced to go to e8. Knight takes g7 check, king d7, queen to f5 check, king c7, knight e6 check, king to b6. The queen comes back to b1 with check, king to a7, and now g7. This pawn at g6 now emerges as a potential queening pawn on the g file. The knight goes to d3, a5. The threat is queen to b6 checkmate. So his opponent plays queen to b4 to block that mate. But here Firouzja plays a very nice final combination to win the game. The first thing he does is he just takes the queen. There's no reason to keep queens on the board. Pawn takes, and then this wonderful move, knight to f8, which blocks the rook's access to the g8 square, and there's no way to stop Firouzja from queening. He plays c3, promotes to a queen, one more time, then queen to g6, hits the knight, and here FIDE Master Mahdavi saw no reason to continue. An amazing comeback from Alireza Firouzja. I hope you enjoyed the game. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.